Wonderful. Well, I'm going to get started and people as they're trickling in, but my introduction is probably the least important part. So let's get started. Welcome and thanks everybody for joining us on day 2 of Winter Games. In today's sessions, we're going to be freestyling with Slack leadership to dive into recent research findings that have helped inform a series of best practices for more successful remote learning and work. You're also going to hear from 2 faculty members from Stanford University share how the unique challenges brought on by the pandemic surface new opportunities to radically transform universities. And we want to hear from you. Throughout the discussion, we're going to initiate 2 poll questions and invite you all to respond, as well as use the chat feature at the bottom to add in your questions and insights. So let's get started. Sheela, please take it away.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Annie. To introduce myself, my name is Sheela Subramanian, and I'm the Senior Director at the Future Forum by Slack. So the Future Forum is a consortium backed by Slack, dedicated to helping companies thrive in the digital first world. And my personal background and interest in education that applies to the university setting is I'm an alum of Stanford, and I'm currently on the board of Stanford Center for Race and Ethnicity. And I also studied at Harvard Business School, where I learned a lot about psychological safety, trust, and belonging. So these are all topics that we're going to discuss today. We have a lot of fun in store today. So I'm going to kick things off with the latest research from the Future Forum, as well as a remote employee experience index. Then we're going to have a dynamic conversation with John C. Mitchell and Maxwell Bigman of Stanford during a 20-minute fireside chat. And then my fellow colleague, Allie Nakonek, will do a deep dive about how you can build your digital campus with Slack. So excited to get started. All right, before we do though, a quick poll. So you'll see something popping up on your screen very shortly. I see it right now, asking you how you describe your mindset toward the current stage of education. We'll share the results during our fireside chat with John and Maxwell. So please fill out the survey, or please fill out the poll. All right. So as many of you may recall, in less than a week in mid-March, organizations, including schools, made bigger changes than they thought were possible. And these changes were largely possible due to underlying shifts in technology, from broadband to VPN and SaaS tools. But many just simply did a lift and shift of practices to video calls, both the good and the bad. So as the Future Forum, we wanted to better understand how the shift to remote was impacting knowledge workers. How has the shift changed people's expectations of work? What groups are doing better and which are doing worse? And what practices, tools, and processes could we as leaders provide to make work better for everyone? So what I want to acknowledge for today's presentation for the next 8 minutes is that we're really focused on knowledge workers within organizations. And it's going to be organization and company centric. But it's important to acknowledge that many of your students will become knowledge workers in just a few years. And we're also seeing universities adopt best of breed enterprise tools more frequently. So we'll debate and discuss this research as well as its applicability to students during my fireside later on with John and Maxwell. Okay, so let's dig into the data. Based on the results from our survey, only 12% of people want to return to offices 5 days a week, and only 16% want to be fully remote. So they never want to come into the office. Most people want flexibility. They want to work in a hybrid environment where they can work from home more often, but they can also leverage physical space together when it's needed. So over the last 10 months, people's expectations have changed. And we see this as a big opportunity for leading organizations. And it's really an opportunity to move from the in-office teams to distributed teams and also tap broader and more diverse talent pools. So companies are really using this as an opportunity to rethink the role of the office and where and how you give people access to shared space. And many companies, including yourself, may already be operating in this hybrid environment, finding ways to allow some people who need offices to go in, while allowing more flexibility for others to work from anywhere more often. But simply where people work is only one part of the equation. So we went deeper in understanding what was working and what wasn't for people working remotely. So enter the Remote Employee Experience Index. So we asked 5,000 people working remotely to compare their experience and asked them to score on a scale from much better to much worse than working in the office, with the midpoint being it's about the same as working in the office. And what you'll see from the data is that the first round of the index showed that work-life balance was better for most working remotely. Work stress levels were better for those working remotely. What we found surprising, and I'd love to talk to John and Maxwell about this, was that among knowledge workers, productivity was reported up rather than down, and belonging is where people are struggling. The sense of isolation, how to be part of a team, but overall, the satisfaction with working remotely was much better than it was in the office. So this index allows us to compare across different groups and different practices that companies can adopt, and we'll dive into those details shortly. But what we found was that the lift and shift, moving 9 to 5 meetings onto video calls, people who did that performed way worse than those who invested in digital tools and really redesigned processes. So what we'll talk about today is that moving from digital transition to transformation means moving beyond putting meetings into video conferencing. It's really about intentionality, each of the pieces in the systems rather than just lifting and shifting. And we believe that the current environment creates a massive opportunity for all of us to rethink how people, processes, and place come together to build better teams, as well as competitive advantages for organizations. All right, so let's start off with people. It's really important to start thinking about people as shifting from office-centric norms to people-centric norms in how we operate. So a few results from the study that we conducted was that what helps on the individual level is when leaders encourage employees to take daily breaks, just getting away from work for an hour during the workday. Planning your day in advance rather than just stumbling from video call to video call, and getting exercise and staying healthy. But what we found surprising was that the employee expectation among leaders was also to make investments in team cohesion, as well as building and maintaining team chemistry. So the interactions that have the most impact on workers' sense of belonging include bi-weekly team celebrations to recognize team member achievements or what they've done over the course of the week, monthly team building activities, as well as games and unstructured group social activities. And as we'll talk to John and Maxwell later, this could apply to the student population as well. In addition, what we learned was that what doesn't help with belonging is having more status meetings. So meeting heavy schedules do not work well in the remote world. And workers who attend weekly status meetings actually felt worse about their sense of belonging than workers who receive status updates asynchronously through digital channels. So this new form of asynchronous communication really depends on companies giving employees access to modern tools. And the index also shows that employees working at companies who are early adopters of technology have dramatically higher sense of belonging scores compared to employees at companies that are slower to adopt technology. And on the topic of sense of belonging, from our research, what we found was that Black, Hispanic, and Asian employees actually feel a stronger sense of belonging when they work remotely relative to the office and compared to their white colleagues. We think this is largely due to code switching, the act of changing your behavior, your appearance, how you talk, in exchange for making others more comfortable, as well as getting more access to opportunities. And working remotely prevents code switching from happening. So what we're realizing is that the physical office was actually a place of exclusion for many groups. Okay, so we have to rethink the job of managers, given all these circumstances and the data that I just mentioned, and help them move from being focused on gatekeeping and attendance and scorekeeping to focus on outcomes rather than output. So manager training and tools really need to focus on 3 core skills. The first is creating clarity. Leaders need to synthesize and share information and provide context that allows their teams to gain momentum. They also just need to create environments where knowledge and context are openly shared among team members and across teams. Second, it's all about inspiring trust. And I'm excited to dig into this part in the fireside. Trust is about investing in people, showing that you care about their well-being, as well as their career development. So ensure psychological safety by showing that you're vulnerable as well. And also, don't information hoard, information share, and build a transparent culture. And the last piece is about unlocking potential. So it's about supporting and challenging teams with diverse perspectives. So as you're investing in digital tools, think about what forums and formats can help you amplify diverse voices, as well as avoid groupthink. In addition, the role of the manager is to remove obstacles and create accountability for results. Accountability needs to be modeled from the leadership level. So leaders need to take personal responsibility for outcomes, but also ensure that everyone on the team is able to deliver. And this applies to instructors as well, as we'll dig into later today. We also found in our research major opportunities to rethink work processes. And I'll go through one key section here. The index shows that one of the single biggest factors that influence a positive remote experience is the ability to break free from the 9 to 5 and instead work a flexible schedule. So employees who have the option to work a flexible schedule actually score higher than those who are forced to continue working 9 to 5 across every element of the index. So as an example, the positive impacts of work-life balance were not surprising to us. But what was interesting for us was to see the result when it came to when it came to productivity, as well as sense of belonging. So those with flexible schedules scored very high on both of those elements. So it's really important for leaders to rethink processes to enable a flexible working environment. Here are a few tips that we have tried out as the Future Forum team, as well as we've worked with customers to implement. The first is setting dedicated team hours. So what we do as the Future Forum is we've set aside blocks of time for team collaboration. So we work from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. 4 days a week, tied to our team's home time zone. It's also important for leaders to enable flexible solo time. So flexibility, as I mentioned in the previous slide, especially for individual contributors, allows people to adjust based on family or personal circumstances, as well as style differences. Not everyone is a morning person. I sure am not. Focus on the clear deliverables and measure outcomes, but just don't rely on meetings to drive these deadlines. And the last piece is something we'll speak about with John and Maxwell. It's about async work, helping teams find ways to work in channels, share documents, whiteboard tools that allow them to work individually, solo, but then debate together. This is not just important for unlocking flexibility, it also helps generate better ideas. Concepts like brain writing rather than brainstorming, where people can work asynchronously before a conversation, drive better idea generation. And the last component is place, the digital space, as well as the physical locations where work happens, and the need for leaders to have intentionality when it comes to both. So the next generation of leaders will move to digital HQ, but will still leverage physical office spaces. And many companies have functions that require access for some portion of the work already, like production studios, high bandwidth computation labs, and many more. And so they've already adopted this model. But even remote first companies like GitLab and Automatic depend on episodic times to build team health and interpersonal relationships. Companies like Dropbox are moving to remote first with studios for teams that need space. So workers who don't need it and don't need to be in the office have voiced their desire for flexibility. So the move to hybrid work environments really opens up massive opportunities to rethink where and who you hire. And talented individuals will go where they can get flexibility to gain that stronger sense of belonging that we talked about earlier. So there's a few areas that we recommend that leaders think about. So an organization's lifeblood should flow through digital channels. And we'll talk more about this in this next fireside. It's important for leaders to think about investing in flexible collaboration tools to bring people to work together. So be really intentional about social bonding and trust, and also transparent communication through your digital channels. In addition, it's important to really think about the open platform where all can participate and engage in different formats and forums. So new digital tools and better practices can and should be used for things like brain writing and asynchronous work. And the last is being really intentional about how you're using your physical spaces when things reopen. So teams need a plan, and they also need regular, episodic, in real life meetings for bonding and trust. So make sure you're thinking about flexible use spaces for that. But also, if you're committing to a hybrid model, you got to make sure that the tone is set from the top. Leadership can't come back into the office, one floor, 5 days a week from 9 to 5. That means that hybrid will fail. So make sure that your leaders are setting an example as well. So intentionality must be brought to digital. It's where you share purpose, information, and decisions, and also to your physical spaces. All right, well, thank you for sharing your time as we walk through this research. Up next, I want to invite John C. Mitchell and Maxwell Bigman to tell us more about the applicability of these data points to the education space. And before we get started, John, Maxwell, do you mind introducing yourself, your focus, and what you've studied about the future of the education space? Thank you.
Sure. Hello, happy to say hi. Good to be here. Great presentation, Sheila. Lots of good thought-provoking ideas in there. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm a professor of computer science. I was previously Stanford Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning for 6 years, and I've been interested in education and technology for supporting education for the last decade or so.
And I'm Maxwell. I'm a PhD student working with John. I was a high school computer science teacher before I started my graduate program and focused on blended models, mixing online and face-to-face instruction in meaningful ways. And so there are a lot more opportunities for that now than there were when I started 2 years ago.
And the two of us have decided, realized in March or April that this was a pretty unusual year. And we should try to collect information, interview our colleagues, try to just record what's happening in higher education so we understand how we're moving forward, and to try to help also all of our colleagues and other people teaching that we're connected to understand the best ideas from each other and sort of spread best practices. So that's been our big focus during this pandemic period.
Okay, so we conducted a poll earlier and we asked people to best describe their mindset toward the current state of higher education. 17% said they were panicked, 33% said they were coping, and 33% said that they were looking forward and planning. And then 17% said, not really sure, that's why I'm here. How are you feeling, John, right now about the future of higher education, just given all that has happened over the last 10 months?
I think we're making a shift, and that split there kind of reflects, I think, the views of people we've talked to too. But I mean, my personal view is January 1 is the time to start thinking forward. Spring was panic and can we get through teaching? Summer was, okay, how did that work? What are we going to do in the fall? Fall was a lot more successful. And so I think we've managed the crisis. Not perfectly, but students are getting through their classes, making progress. They're going to graduate. Things are, working in a way they couldn't have a decade ago. And so now it's really what we're trying to do, and what I'm encouraging my colleagues to do is think about what have we learned over the last 9 months? What are we going to learn more over the next 6? And what are the things we want to take away and leverage and remember so that we really profit in some way, benefit from all of the hard work and learning that's happened over this period.
Okay. And how are you feeling, Maxwell, about your experience over the last 10 months?
Yeah, I think the common thread across instructors and students and leaders from the conversations that we've had has been one of fatigue at this point. I think like this break is where that kind of pivot is possible to happen from coping to future looking. I think the kind of what students want out of their experience is shifting as well. And I mean, I can speak to my own experience, but I think that kind of broader student demand is definitely shifting in a way that we haven't quite seen just yet.
Maybe to give a little more context also, some of the things you mentioned have really been part of our view for a long period of time. Working towards the virtual campus, we've had for decades computer science classes broadcast, recorded the lecture, available on video. People have stopped coming to class because they can watch the lecture on video. So I think we're on the same sort of path as other kinds of organizations and enterprises. What we've learned during the pandemic is there are some things that we hadn't been attentive to that have to be part of our future virtual campus. So somehow students manage to learn stuff by talking to each other and studying together in groups and all those kind of things. And those we didn't have to scaffold as teachers because students were on campus and they figured that out themselves. Now that they're spread out and scattered to the winds, we have a much greater responsibility for the success of our students because we're in the middle of much more of their activity. And I think that's parallel to some of the things you mentioned, Sheela, about the responsibility of managers.
Yeah.
So we're pursuing that, and that's one of the things that Maxwell and I have been working on is how do we help students meet each other, learn from each other, do all those things they would have done kind of informally and below the radar from the point of view of the teaching staff, and how do we make that possible in this virtual future?
So you kind of referenced the role of the instructor being a connector, a hub, someone bringing people together. What do you think about the new role of an instructor being a coach and a confidant and a trust builder? Like, how do you think about building those emotional connections, given that a lot of people are struggling at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Maxwell speak to that too as an experienced teacher. I think that's been the prevailing view in education for some period of time. And it's definitely true in the college situation. If you take any topic that I teach with the kind of students we have, the collective knowledge in the classroom may be greater than mine. But, I've spent a fair amount of time trying to learn stuff. And so I try to help people chart their path through the problems and the topics they're interested in and learn things. And I think our responsibility, our role involves much more the issues you talked about now in the pandemic. And that's going to be a big change for educators, I think, for the better, for us to pay more attention to how students are doing and what's successful for them, will be great. Max, what are your thoughts? You've thought about these things.
I mean, what we've seen consistently is the courses that students are most content with and that have the most success are ones in which instructors are very attuned to their student experiences, both in the course and how they're doing in their personal lives. I think in K-12, the idea of trust being the foundation of strong teaching and learning has been around for a while, as John said. I think that there's been a new awareness of the role that instructors have in this remote environment where all the campus services that students take advantage of, the student support networks, the affinity groups aren't really as accessible. And so they're turning to their courses to kind of get that experience, to get that sense of community. I think that you referenced sense of belonging is down in office environments. I think it's way down in campus environments, because if you think about where life happens, it's on campus. It's walking to class, it's seeing your friends, it's getting a meal, and that has all gone away. And so in terms of imagining what that looks like in a new digital campus, there's going to be elements that are going to be really hard to replicate, but that can augment the in-person experience when people return to campuses.
It's sort of surprising in a way that the survey results that we've seen suggest that both students and faculty would like to continue to have distance learning, at least as an option. And I think that ties in directly with the slide that you showed, Sheela, about 72% of the people don't want to go back to working in the office all the time. They don't want to be home all the time. We have the same phenomenon in education. And it's a little bit paradoxical, because if you ask about most of the other things, people rate current distance learning kind of negatively. Yeah. I can't find my professor. I can't find other students. It's complicated. I'm tired of being on Zoom. All those things are prominent. But yet when you ask, would you like more of this? Yeah, they would. And I think one of the issues comes down to the point you made about scheduling flexibility. And so what we've seen in also another phenomenon that distinguishes the more successful courses from the less are providing more asynchronous activities for students. If students can choose when to do something, that's a big advantage for them. And so we're moving a lot of our classes from many synchronous class meetings to many fewer meetings, more synchronous options. But then, as you said, some dedicated team time, these office hours or discussion sections where people have a few hours each week where they get together with other students or with the teaching staff, and they know someone's going to be there and listen. So I found that to be very close parallel with what you're seeing in other work environments.
And so in the physical office environment, oftentimes it was about FaceTime and it was about activity and being there. How do you think about prioritizing outcomes in the education system? And how does this apply to grading in a virtual environment? And also using this as an opportunity to rethink how grading has been done.
That's great. Do you want to start with that, Maxwell?
Yeah, I think the number one shift that we're seeing is that students are asking for a lot more flexibility and in response to a lot of the disruptions they're facing and the challenges that they might have at their home working environments. The number one thing that has helped with that is what, the fancy term is mastery-based learning. A simpler way of understanding it is just the ability to revise and resubmit your work, whether that's a problem set, a homework, an exam. Giving students the opportunity to prove that they have mastered the material, that they have demonstrated proficiency, and offering flexibility in how they do that is something that has typically not been offered in many of the classes, and is something that most instructors seem to be adopting now, and that students are responding really positively to. John, are there other things that are worth mentioning?
I mean, you can understand our current situation is a combination of two things. One is we're experimenting big time, worldwide, all classes, all colleges, with distance learning. And the other thing is we're coping with a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so some of the things we are doing are probably pandemic specific. Some of the stress, the challenges, the disarray is not going to be pervasive, for decades. And I think that will calm down. But the advantages of being distant and flexibility in time and space are going to continue. On this particular issue of grading and assessment, part of the reason everybody wants to relax is students are under stress. We've had political issues, we have protests, we've had riots, people have in families where somebody is sick, there are all kinds of calamities here. But in backing off and rethinking and trying to be a little more flexible, I think it's given many instructors a chance to catch up with what has been educational, what education research has shown anyway, that, creating a competitive, stressful environment simply to have competition doesn't really help anybody. What we really want is to set out a set of learning objectives, learning goals for a course. And then if everybody achieves that, great, have the grades reflect that. And as Maxwell said, if someone wants to do the exam 3 times, but they learn something more each time, that's great. We shouldn't have, we should all be open to that. And so I think the crisis has opened our eyes collectively, and many people are rethinking teaching in a way that has brought them towards things that experts and researchers in education have known for a while. So we're going to see some evolution in adoption of best practices. And I think, focusing on the goals, outcomes, as opposed to how many hours you sat in the class and what you did, in a certain superficial way is really progress for everyone.
Great, thank you. And one note to attendees is Andrea Gomez just asked a poll question in our Zoom chat about how others are measuring student success, especially given that they're in the face of a more stressful environment. So please feel free to respond and engage in that conversation. Okay, so in terms of async work, the role of the instructor, the experience of the student, how do you think that instructors as well as students can best use their synchronous time together? And Maxwell, from a student perspective, what's your take on breakout rooms for discussion? Like, do they actually replicate the discussion experience, or where are some areas that instructors can actually experiment?
Yeah, I mean, those are two different questions. So I don't know if John, you want to tackle the synchronous and
I'm lumping it all in
asynchronous.
because I know that we're also short on
Yeah,
time.
let's divide it that way. That sounds good. As we mentioned, what we're recommending, what many people are doing is dividing the class meeting time. Half of it now becomes asynchronous, and then half of it becomes synchronous. And now your question is, what do we do with that to make it best use of that? Really, people learn by trying something, by struggling with something, and they learn from each other. So the most common use is something that's gone by the term active learning. But it's basically one technique is give groups of students small challenge questions, break them up into groups, ask them to work on that, and then come back and see how people did and work from that afterwards. So that's one way to take advantage of synchronous time. Another can be a small discussion section or other formats. But since the first use breakout rooms, that leads into the question for Matthew. Maxwell, how do students like breakout rooms? Do they like them?
Yeah, so from our research, and I'll speak to my own experience, breakout rooms have been the single most polarizing piece of the online learning experience. Some instructors and students report that it's great, and some hate it. It's definitely not the same thing as a classroom discussion. It seems to me that the biggest difference is in courses where you know the people that you're in the breakout room with, whether you knew them before you arrived in that class or the instructor has done an explicit job in kind of building up and scaffolding that social support and that trust and psychological safety with one another, that people really are able to engage in some quality work. The flip side is, you're in a 150-person lecture and you get thrown into a 2-minute breakout discussion, and suddenly you're in a room with 3 strangers, they're looking in your home, and you're wondering if you should share anything. And obviously, often there's no conversation that happens, and if it is, it's not as meaningful. So I think again, it's this need to architect collaboration in a meaningful way and build these relationships for students, which used to happen much more naturally in courses, and is just a lot harder in a virtual environment.
I guess you can think about being a student as working 4 jobs at the same time if you're taking 4 classes, and changing that set of 4 jobs, every semester. And so you don't really have the same continuity in people knowing each other and understanding their role relative to others that you do in many workplaces.
Okay. So we're getting a lot of interest from the group as well. So I want to make sure that we also have time for people to ask questions. Judy Callahan, you raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question relevant to what we just discussed?
Yeah, it's in the high flex situation, which seems to me to violate every well-considered pedagogy. How do you handle that, where students can choose, I want to go to class, I don't want to go to class, and you still have people in front of you?
Maybe I'll speak to that briefly. We've had that situation on campus for a long time. And one thing that I've learned and have made progress on myself is understanding what is the class for the student. So we think of it as the class meeting is the real thing, but actually what students experience over the course of a term is the homework, the exams, meeting the study groups, if they do a project, if they work with other students. Those are all kind of the ways they spend their time. And so I think that the simplest thing from an instructor standpoint is change your focus from what happens in the room with me to what's the experience of the student overall. How do I connect into whether that's working for them, and how do I support them in that? So one thing that we find really, really helpful is like a weekly quiz in this environment. Ask everybody every week, how are you doing outside of class? Do you have a safe place to work? Is your internet connection working? are you okay? And by the way, are you following the class? Are you behind? Is there something you don't understand? And did you understand this point we discussed last week? So if you kind of try to keep track of where people are and how they're progressing, and then put your attention into how to make that successful, that might help in some way. Because I know it is really discouraging to have, for me, we have 200, 300 people in the class and there are only 30 there. And, so you feel like you're talking to the void. That's kind of not a rewarding teaching experience if you see it that way. Does that address what you're thinking?
I guess it's fine in a more lecture-based curriculum, but the courses that I teach, I'm a high level, hands-on, give people things that they can do and use. I'm in a business school. And so in a high participative environment, it makes it very difficult.
But what I've seen and heard from business school colleagues where the courses are much smaller than what we have in my department is try to meet with every student individually, once a week. And that will give you a really good idea of what's going on with them.
And it also seems that breaking even a small group into smaller groups and creating that synchronous time is what's been most valuable in the computer science classes. There's the lecture, but there's also a required synchronous discussion section. That's something like 12 students with one teaching assistant that is, really tasked with helping that group. And so I can see in an environment that's even smaller than that making sure those small groups still have time to work together. And that's maybe where the instructor can leverage the ability to still be high touch, despite the fact that it's a little more challenging.
Yeah, to kind of move on to this, but I would point you to some resources. So if you look at the Stanford Business School, if you look online for suggestions on teaching online, they'll have some of these points and they're pretty thoughtful on that.
Okay, so we could talk for probably 2 more hours. This has been a really rich conversation. Thank you, Maxwell and John. We also have to shift things over to Allie shortly. John and Maxwell, could you just tell us a bit more about where people can find out more? You just mentioned the business school website, but find out more about what you're working on in your research, as well as the best way to connect with you.
Great. So we just set up something and we'll put it in the chat. It's we're thinking a decade ahead. Like what's going to happen in the next decade. So if you go to decadeahead.com, you'll find us and we'll post more there so we can connect that way.
That's great.
And we're planning to have like a monthly newsletter to just what we're reading, what we're thinking about, resources. So be on the lookout for that as well.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us. Good to see everybody and great to talk. Thanks, Sheela.
Yes, and I'm going to pass it over to Allie Nakonek to tell us more about how Slack can help you build your digital campus. Thank you, Allie.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Maxwell and John. Really appreciate the dialogue we were able to have here today. And of course, for all of you for staying tuned in. I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. So in the spirit of Olympic Games, I hope you've all been enjoying the sessions you've dived into so far. But in the second half of this section, as we close out, we want to leave you with some tangible resources. So if we think about Winter Games and the Olympics, obviously part of that is going to be training, preparing, and then performing. And to tie together some of the dialogue that John and Maxwell and Sheila all had, those common themes of people, process, and technology are very near and dear to our hearts at Slack, where I work. And I'm a customer success manager for our higher education customers who are really building out a digital campus for engagement, community building, learning and teaching, as well as kind of collaborating beyond the walls of a university, all within the collaboration hub that is Slack itself. So connecting students, faculty, staff in the functions and interactions that matter most to them through a single platform. And I think one of the common challenges that we've talked about in the research that Sheila shared, as well as the reality of the student experience that John and Maxwell talked about, this idea that there's an increased burden on faculty and staff to really architect what that experience looks like in the absence of a physical campus space, is what we're trying to foster and make more accessible through Slack. So Stanford, Arizona State, other schools in the nation use what's called Slack Enterprise Grid, which allows you to have multiple workspaces in our Slack platform managed centrally, typically through university IT. So these could be workspaces representative of physical spaces like a classroom, like the library, perhaps a school all in itself, all connected so that staff, faculty, and students can interact at scale, but also in the focused areas that matter most to them in their journey. So with that context, let the games begin. Let's go through a couple scenarios that hopefully leave you thinking and walking away with some inspiration on how you can help drive that percentage of engagement and satisfaction and hopefully anxiety reducing challenges that Sheela talked about in her research in the reality of remote work today. One being what the classroom looks like. So in this case, how could a classroom be represented in Slack or another digital tool that you might be using on your campus to accelerate a student's journey through their studies or through the finish line? In this case, we have an example where a workspace in Slack is actually tied to a school. And the channels that fall within there might be the specific classes in that program. It might be a faculty member's office hours so that they're more visibly accessible to the students at different times for sign-up slots. And I think in the spirit of asynchronous, it's a way to extend the conversation beyond the classroom. So while you might, in Judy's example of a business school, share a reading or a video or a content that a student can digest on their own time flexibly, this channel then becomes the forum for a robust discussion that you might not have time for on your Zoom call, where you get that one-on-one interaction and deeper engagement through things perhaps like online polls, like we've done here in Zoom today. From a community perspective, you can also use Slack for, outside of the classroom. So that delta of how students are meeting ad hoc and engaging with each other without maybe the direct connection of, hey, we're in the same class together. You can create a community workspace to unite an Olympic-worthy team, where really this case is give those students an easy, direct home for the conversations that might happen naturally on campus so that they have the autonomy to create the channels and conversations that they might have otherwise found naturally on campus, whether that's a club, an activity, Greek life. Let them kind of explore and build out the community without too much hand-holding, but securely in a workspace that's accessible to them and staff and faculty for sponsorship. And lastly, the idea of staff and faculty was the foundation of Sheela's workspace or research, and that's often what we're seeing Slack take root in first, especially at Stanford. So thinking of Slack also as a hub for the services that a university provides and relies on to operate on the day-to-day. So keeping that ski slope smooth, making sure students have access to the resources that they might need, the facilities that they might have perhaps used on campus, like libraries and athletics, and really providing them, again, a home to access those services. And then using channels in Slack to really specify, hey, I need help, where do I go? In a single glance, I can tell, hey, this is the financial aid channel that I can go and ask my question in. And as a service provider, you don't necessarily need to be in an office at a given time. You can share those requests in bulk with your team on the schedule that works most for you. So those are some examples, hopefully to help drive some of the recommendations that Sheela had provided in context. We hope that you are walking away with some ideas on how you can help drive up that engagement, both with your peers and especially with students in these stressful times. And with that, I believe Andrea posted a couple more resources in our chat today that you can find out more about how to leverage Slack specifically. But otherwise, very grateful for all of your attendance, and huge shout out to John, Maxwell, and Sheela, as well as our coordinators on ASU and Slack's side. Happy New Year all, and enjoy the rest of Winter Games.